Good evening and welcome to the event this evening of the launch of the English translation of Ilse Aichinger's collected essays on film and fate, or camera flashes illuminating a life. My name's Andrew Bonnell. I teach history at the university, specialising in German and Central European history, and so I thank Wilkes very much for the honour of being invited to open this event and to say a few words. Could I, before I start, just make one announcement that as much of this evening will be artistic performances, which will be require a bit more sort of skill and artistic concentration than the usual academic classroom event. The organisers have requested no photography, and please keep the phones on silent if they aren't already, as you would in the theatre. As Ilse Aichinger's writings largely deal with themes of dispossession and disappearance, I think it's only appropriate, in accordance with usual protocols at the University of Queensland, that I begin by acknowledging that we're gathered on the land of the traditional owners and custodians, and on everyone's behalf I pay our respects to the Turrbal and Jagera peoples of Brisbane and to all of their elders, past, present and future. I'd like to acknowledge the people who've made this evening possible, and firstly there's the author Ilse Aichinger, and if you haven't yet obtained a copy, of course the purpose of a book launch is to sell as many of these as possible, and you know, there's a collection of this and Eichinger's great first and only novel from 1948, The Greater Hope, also translated by Geoff Wilkes, and they're available in the foyer if you haven't got them already, and people are available to sign them, and there are other great publications, including Gail Wiltshire's analysis of Eichinger's work, so I commend the book table to you. So Aichinger was a remarkable writer. I encountered her as an undergraduate student of German because some of her short prose pieces appeared a fair bit in anthologies, although she didn't have a large reputation in the English-speaking world, but Geoff Wilkes and Gail Wiltshire are in the process of changing that. Aichinger was born in 1921 in Vienna, at a time when Vienna was impoverished and recovering from the rigours of an unsuccessful, for Austria, First World War, but still had that sort of cultural richness that we associate with Vienna in the early 20th century. When the German state, under the leadership of the Nazi Party, annexed Austria in 1938, Aichinger found herself belonging to the category defined by the Nazis and the regulations to the 1935 Nuremberg laws as a Mischling first degree, which meant a mixed race person with two Aryan so-called grandparents and two grandparents classified by the Nazis' racial ideology as Jewish. Although Aichinger herself never seems to have felt any attachment to either Judaism or much to Christianity beyond conventional Christmas celebrations. Aichinger was thus in a group that was discriminated against by the Nazis. So-called Mischlinge were in an ambiguous situation in that they weren't subjected to the immediate wave of violence and persecution, and it should be noted that when the Nazis did march into Vienna in March 1938, a city which had a population of over 200,000 Jews at the time, that Adolf Eichmann came from Berlin to make an example of Vienna, to show how you can drive the Jewish population out of the city as fast as possible, and Jews were subjected to an overt wave of violence. and persecution, which resulted in the emigration of something like 130,000 Viennese Jews, with about 70,000 remaining. Of those 70,000, 65,000 were persecuted to Nazi death camps, and only a couple of thousand returned. Among the deported to Nazi death camps and execution sites were Ilse Aichinger's grandmother and her mother's sisters, who perished somewhere near Minsk in 1942. And Aichinger repeatedly comes back to the memory of seeing her family members on a truck being driven out of the city, and the mixture of indifference and hostility and contempt from many of the Viennese passers-by. It's one of the disturbing motifs that recurs in Aichinger's reminiscences. Aichinger herself was separated from her twin sister Helga, who managed to get on one of the last so-called Kindertransporter evacuation convoys of children sent to Britain for safety, while Aichinger survived the war in an increasingly precarious situation in Vienna. Aichinger emerged as a significant writer in the post-war period after surviving the horrors of the Second World War in Vienna. She was immediately recognised, or very soon recognised, by one of the most important groups of writers in post-war West Germany, the Gruppe 47, or the 47 group of young German writers determined to remake the German language after its abuse at the hands of the Nazis. She received their literary prize in 1952 for her short story, Mirror Story, that she wrote the previous year. She only wrote the one novel, which has been studied by Gale and translated by Geoff. There was an earlier translation, but it's fair to say the earlier one is not only very hard to get, it's been superseded by the recent edition. Aichinger continued to work in shorter forms, short prose pieces, radio plays, which were quite popular in Germany in the 1960s, so it's probably a genre many people have forgotten about now, but it was quite popular in the 50s and 60s, and poems. And as I said, her work was much anthologized. Late in life, she had this remarkable reawakening of her literary powers as she wrote a series of sketches about film and photography for the Viennese newspaper Der Standard, the Standard, and these are indeed remarkable pieces, which you'll hear see excerpts from in the course of the evening. The pieces mix reflections, her memories of being a theatre goer, cinema goer in the 20s and 30s, and her memories of the great figures of the silent cinema era, but then she also comments on cultural figures of the recent past, people who are our contemporaries. So after reading about people like Leo de Putti, a star of the silent screen in Germany in the 20s, and Marianne Hopper, a star of the Nazi cinema and then the German theatre in the 40s, she'll jump to talking about Bob Dylan or Gillian Anderson. And then reading these pieces, she suddenly becomes our contemporary, but she's still introducing these memories of the experience of life under Nazi persecution in Vienna and the horrors of seeing family members taken away. So through these literary means, she's bringing the Nazi persecution and mass murder of the Jews very much into our present, and is also, I think, trying to sort of trouble the conscience of an Austria which until the 1990s had been certainly until the 1980s, had been somewhat amnesiac about Austria's own involvement in Nazism. I'd like to say a little bit about my old colleague and friend, Geoff Wilkes. Geoff is emerging as a internationally recognised, I shouldn't say he's emerging, it sounds like he's not there yet, but he is a leading internationally recognised authority on German literature, especially of the interwar period, after his early work on the very popular German writer Hans Fallada. It's, I think, not an exaggeration to say that his involvement in the republication of Fallader's novel Alone in Berlin, which he didn't translate but contributed an afterword for, contributed to the revival of interest in Hans Fallader in the English-speaking world, which ultimately led to a movie being made of the film, and Geoff neglected to get film rights. I hope you sort of get that in the next translation contract. You should get a cut of the film rights for the next translation or afterword. He also contributed an afterword to an English version of the novel by Irmgard Coyne, After Midnight, and then translated another novel by Coyne called Gilgi, One of Us, and sorry, Gilgi, or One of Us. Coyne being best known for her popular novel The Artificial Silk Girl, dramatising the new woman's lot in interwar Germany. With Gail's assistance in and organisational drive in getting these projects together, Geoff has also now done a translation of The Greater Hope, Eichinger's first and only novel, which won the major Austrian translation prize not long ago. And he and Gail have followed that with Film and Fate, this collection of remarkable prose pieces that Aichinger wrote very late in her life. She only died in 2016, so you know, she's still very much our contemporary, even though many of the things she wrote about are in the 1930s. I'd also like to recognise Gail Wiltshire, of course, who is no doubt you know, responsible for making this whole event happen. Gail has gone from being an honours student in German at this university to being quite a formidable scholar of German literature, and her writings on Aichinger repay careful reading. She's also shown this remarkable drive that is so characteristic of her in getting to know the family and getting a number of these projects off the ground, and you know, becoming a wonderful advocate for Aichinger and her work in the English-speaking world. So Gail is something of a you know, cross between a German philologist and a force of nature, I think it's fair to say. The current book, as I said, you'll be getting dramatised versions, so anything else I say about it will be weak by comparison. We also have a musical item this evening with excerpts from Schubert's Winterreise, and I've been reminded what the link is between the Winterreise and Ilse Eichinger's work. And there's a letter which Gail obtained a copy of, an unpublished manuscript letter, which is an incredibly moving document written by Aichinger in the last winter of the Second World War in Vienna, in war-torn Vienna, to her twin sister, whom she hadn't seen since 1938 in England. And it's a 4-page long letter to her twin sister, and expresses her longing for her in wintry Vienna, and she particularly speaks of how she has to remember her sister whenever she hears Schubert's Winterreise, Winter's Journey, on the radio. But thinking about the connections between the Winterreise and Eichinger's work, there's more than one connection. Obviously, both of them incorporate a sort of Viennese culture, although it's not the sort of frivolous, light-hearted Viennese culture that we associate so popularly with Vienna. It's recorded that when Schubert first played the Winterreise to a group of his friends, they were shocked at how dark and sombre it sounded. They were expecting something lighter and more cheerful. But the mastery of short forms that Schubert shows in this, and his capacity to say powerful things in an apparently simple form, is very reminiscent of Eichinger's mastery of short forms that is also used to make a powerful statement as well. So without any sort of further ado from me, I'll hand over to the musicians for excerpts from Schubert's Winterreise.
This evening we're presenting some readings from Ilse Aichinger's Film und Verhängnis, Blitzlichter auf ein Leben, which I've translated as Film and Fate, Camera Flashes Illuminating a Life. I'll call it Film and Fate for short. Film and Fate was first published in 2001, when Aichinger was in her 80th year. It's a collection of short pieces. One of the pieces is the speech she gave when she was awarded the Grand Austrian State Prize in 1996, which was at a very late stage in her career. And some others seem to have been written specifically for Film and Fate, but most of them had been published previously in a Vienna newspaper called The Standard. Pretty much all of the pieces were autobiographical in some way, and the key events in Aichinger's and her family's history were the Nazi takeover of Austria in March 1938 and the experiences of exile, persecution and genocide which followed. I won't say anything else about the history, as we'll be reading three pieces from Film and Fate, and I can leave Aichinger's words to speak for her. The only thing I will say before we begin the readings is that the title Film and Fate reflects what Aichinger herself called her addiction to the cinema. As she was born in 1921, that addiction began in the era of the silent films, and it persisted until her last years. In an interview in 2003, she said that she went to the movies up to 4 times a day. So many of the pieces in the Standard, which are reprinted in Film and Fate, were about films or actors or directors. Although not the first piece, which we're presenting this evening, which is Aichinger's acceptance speech for the Grand Austrian State Prize in 1996. The title is The Ground Beneath Our Feet. And I think that if I had to choose one text to explain what Ilse Aichinger experienced and what she thought, this would be the one.
Der Boden unter unseren Füßen,
The ground beneath our feet.
das Misstrauen gegen den Staat, gegen jeden Staat, Verwaltungsgremien, Ämter, die ziemlich unzugänglichen edlen Bauten, in denen die Ministerien, Behörden, zuständige Kanzleien und Büros, im Kriegsfall sicher auch Stabsbüros, untergebracht sind, begann bei mir früh.
Distrust of the state, of any state, of administrative committees, of government offices, of the noble and rather inaccessible edifices which house the ministries, the government authorities, the responsible chancelleries and the bureau, and in wartime, of course, the military staff officers too. What a distrust I felt early.
Ich fragte, wie fast jeder, vieles in der Zeit des Heranwachsens.
As I asked a lot of questions as when I was growing up, as everybody does.
Nach dem Staat fragte ich nicht.
I didn't ask about the state.
Er hatte für mein Empfinden zu viele Gesichter. Eines überdeckte das andere und eine staatliche Stelle stand wachsam für die andere.
I felt that it had too many faces, one obscuring the other, and one part of the state stood guard for the other.
Man kam da nicht durch.
You couldn't get through.
Wenn ihr euch nicht festhalten lasst, gehe ich zum Wachmann, erklärte das Kindermädchen fast täglich während unserer eintönigen Spaziergänge.
If you children don't hold my hand, I'll fetch the policeman, was the nanny's almost daily cry during our monotonous walks.
Dieser oft herbeizitierte Wachmann war für mich die erste leibhaftige Staatsform.
Yes, this oft-invoked policeman was the first tangible incarnation of the state for me.
Damals wusste ich noch nichts von Thoreau und schon gar nichts von seinem Essay über die Pflicht des Ungehorsams gegen den Staat. Der kam mir sehr spät in die Hand und zu dieser Zeit hatte ich schon genügend Erfahrungen gesammelt.
Back then, I hadn't yet heard of Thoreau, let alone his essay, on the duty of civil disobedience. It only came into my hands much later, by which time I had already gathered sufficient experience.
Das sind Juden, erklärte die Greislerin schräg gegenüber der Wohnung unserer Großmutter, wenn wir zu ihr um Milch oder Zucker kamen, und zeigte über den Ladentisch auf uns hinunter.
They're Jews. The woman who ran the little shop across the street and down the way from our grandmother's apartment would announce, reaching over the counter to point down at us whenever we went to buy milk or sugar from her.
Das vorher eilige und drängelnde Publikum, das sie anbiedernd Therese nannte, kam wieder langsam zurück und betrachtete meine Schwester und mich.
The other customers, who addressed her ingratiatingly as Teresa, stopped hurrying and jostling, came back slowly to inspect my sister and me.
Wir gingen rasch wieder hinaus, kamen atemlos bei unserer Großmutter an und erzählten kein Wort davon.
We hastened out of the shop again. Were out of breath when we arrived back at our grandmother's, but didn't say a word about what had happened.
Stattdessen begannen wir, um den Wohnzimmertisch zu laufen, auf Strümpfen und nicht lange, denn schon bald klopfte die unter uns wohnende Partei, wie man sagte, und mir scheint der Ausdruck heute nicht schlecht gewählt, mit dem Besen an ihre Decke.
Instead, we started running around the living room table in our stockings, and not for long though, because the party living in the apartment below was very soon knocking underneath our floor with a broom. Party was the word people used then, and in hindsight, it doesn't seem a bad choice.
Der Boden unter unseren Füßen war also nicht da, um sich darauf zu bewegen.
So the floor of our grandmother's apartment and the ground beneath our feet weren't there for us to move freely upon them.
Es war ein fester Boden.
It was it was firm,
Aber ein Boden ohne Gewehr.
but not guaranteed.
Fest und ohne Gewehr.
Firm, but not guaranteed.
Unter ihm lauerten die Besenstiele, auf denen angeblich die Hexen davonflogen, wenn ihre Feste zu Ende waren.
Yes, subject to attack by the broomsticks. The witches were said to fly away on when their Sabbaths were over.
Und auch aus diesem Fußboden ergab sich für mich eine deutliche Folgerung für die Beschaffenheit des Staates.
And this flaw, too, prompted me to draw a conclusion about the characteristics of the state.
Einmal rief jemand, der Justizpalast brennt.
Yes, once someone called out, "Oh, the palace of justice is on fire."
Das berührte mich nicht.
That meant nothing to me.
Justizpalast.
Palace of justice.
Das klang ohne Feuer fast bedrohlicher als im Feuer.
That sounded almost more threatening when it wasn't a flame than when it was.
Soweit die ersten Erfahrungen.
These were the first experiences.
Später wurden diese Erfahrungen massiver.
Later, these experiences became weightier.
Und der Preis für sie wuchs rasch.
And the price for them increased rapidly.
Und begann nicht erst nach dem hier begeistert begrüßten Überfall Hitlers.
And it wasn't only after Hitler's victory here, which was greeted, oh, so enthusiastically,
sondern vor allem nach seinem Ende rasch zu steigen.
but most of all after his defeat, that the price began to climb rapidly.
Zwar gab es jetzt einen anderen Staat, einen Staat, in dem man nicht aus dem Haus gezerrt und ermordet werden konnte, aber schon wieder einen Staat mit verschlossenen Türen und mit dem amtlichen Tonfall, der sich in Wien häufiger und rascher als anderswo dem Zynismus nähert.
Admittedly, there was a different state then, a state in which you couldn't be dragged from your home and murdered. But once again, there was a state with locked doors and with an official attitude which approaches cynicism more often and more rapidly in Vienna than elsewhere.
Die Formulierungen der Behörden waren jedenfalls vor und nach dem Krieg dieselben und haben sich für mich bis heute nicht wesentlich geändert.
No, but in any case, the way the government authorities said things was the same after the war as before, and as far as I'm concerned, it has hardly changed to this day.
Schlafend in der Hängematten,
Well, sleep in hammocks.
hieß es, als ich, nachdem meine Mutter Wohnung und ärztliche Praxis verloren hatte, auf dem Wohnungsamt vorsprach.
Yes, that was the answer I got when I went to the housing office for help after my mother had lost her apartment and her medical practice.
Auch heute bekommt man, wenn man eine Anfrage bei Behörden riskiert, besonders bei untergeordneten Stellen, den Eindruck, an eine Mauer zu stoßen.
Yes, and even today, if you risk making an inquiry of some authority or other, and particularly of a lower level official, you have the impression of butting up against a wall.
Was mich von Thoreau unterscheidet,
The difference between Thoreau and me is this.
er kann sich, wie er schreibt, einen guten Staat vorstellen,
Yeah, he writes that he can imagine a good state,
auch wenn er ihn noch nie gesehen hat.
although he has never actually seen one.
Ich nicht.
I can't.
Wo Ordnung geschaffen werden muss, liegt Willkür immer nahe genug.
Where it's necessary to create order, despotism is never far away.
Der Staat verlangt nach Staatstheorien.
A state requires theories of the state.
Theorien verwandeln sich leicht in Devisen.
Theories turn rapidly into mottos.
Devisen in Maximen.
Mottos into maxims.
Und Maximen in Willkür.
And maxims into despotism.
Da ich nicht die sogenannte Gnade der späten Geburt hatte,
This progression became painfully clear to me, given that I didn't enjoy what the Chancellor Helmut Kohl called the gift of being born afterwards.
eine absurde Formulierung,
An absurd designation.
die wie Holocaust überdeckt und verfälscht, anstatt zu definieren, wurden mir diese Übergänge massiv klar.
Yeah, which obscures and falsifies instead of defining, just as Holocaust does.
Der Vater meiner Mutter war ein Angestellter der Nordbahn. Seine erste größere Stellung war die des Stationsvorstands eines kleinen und unbekannten Ortes, Auschwitz. Später bekam er den Auftrag, die bosnischen Bahnen auszubauen. Die Wiener Behörden waren zufrieden. Weitere Aufträge bekam er, da er die jüdische Religion, an die er nicht glaubte, nicht aus Karrieregründen ablegen wollte, nicht mehr. Er starb sicherlich in dem Bewusstsein, nicht viel getan zu haben. Ich hoffe, er starb ruhig.
My grandmother's father was an employee of the Northern Railway. His first significant position was that of station master in a fairly small and obscure place, Auschwitz. Later, he was given the task of building up the Bosnian railways, and the authorities in Vienna were satisfied. As he was unwilling to renounce the Jewish religion to further his career, even though he didn't believe in it, he wasn't given any further tasks. I'm sure he died with the consciousness of not really having done very much. I hope he died peacefully.
Meine Großmutter hatte dieses Glück nicht. Sie wurde gemeinsam mit den jüngeren Geschwistern meiner Mutter nach Minsk deportiert, gefoltert und im Mai 1942 ermordet.
My grandmother wasn't so fortunate. Together with my mother's younger siblings, she was deported to Minsk, tortured and murdered in May 1942.
Mein Großvater hatte mehr Glück. Er brachte es zwar nur zu einem bescheidenen Offiziersrang, da er ebenfalls nicht bereit war, die ungeliebte und ungeglaubte jüdische Religion abzulegen. Aber er starb ruhig in seinem Schlafzimmer. Meine Mutter behandelte ihn und legte zuletzt ihre Hand auf seinen Kopf. Er wurde auf dem jüdischen Friedhof, einem Teil des Zentralfriedhofs Viertes Tor, beerdigt. Und ich trug, wie meine Schwester, einen Trauerflor über den Ärmel unserer Klosteruniform. Nicht ohne einen gewissen Stolz.
My grandfather was more fortunate. Although he achieved only a modest rank as army officer, because he also wasn't prepared to renounce Jewish religion, which he didn't love, which he didn't believe in. Still he died peacefully in his own bed, with my mother treating him and putting her hand on his head at the end. He was buried in the Jewish cemetery, which was part of the Central Cemetery, Gate 4, And my sister and I wore black armbands on our convent school uniforms, not without a certain pride.
Meine Großmutter wäre glücklich und mein Großvater wäre stolz, wenn sie von ihrem Preis erführen. Auch meine Mutter, die sehr alt wurde und es noch leicht hätte erleben können, aber jetzt ist niemand mehr da für Stolz oder Freude. Dazu kommt, dass ich kein dem Staat ergebener Dichter bin, auch wenn das nicht unbedingt in diesem Preis impliziert ist. Wie schon gesagt, ich fürchte das Wort Staat und nicht nur das Wort.
My grandmother would be happy, and my father would be proud if they were to hear about your prize. My mother would be too. She lived to a great age and could well have come to such a presentation. But now, there's no one left to feel pride or joy. And anyway, I'm not the kind of author who's devoted to the state, even if that's not necessarily implied in this prize. As I said before, I'm afraid of the word state. And not just the word.
I might note at this point that translating Film and Fate presented a number of what translators euphemistically call challenges. For this speech, I had to think for a while about what Aichinger calls, without attribution, die sogenannte Gnade der späten Geburt. Literally, the so-called gift or the so-called grace of late birth. This is fairly recognisable to a German-speaking reader as a rather controversial distinction drawn in the early 1980s by the then German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, a distinction between those who arguably had a direct responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi era and their successors, who arguably have a different kind of responsibility. But for an English-speaking reader, I decided that I needed to explain the quotation's context explicitly for it to maintain its full resonance. So, as you've heard, my translation was what German Chancellor Helmut Kohl called the gift of being born afterwards. Our second reading this evening is called The Beatles in Autumn in Vienna. And it begins with Aichinger going to the movies to see the Beatles film A Hard Day's Night, again, decades after its original release. As you'll hear, this sparks memories of England after the Second World War, of Eichinger's life in Großgemein in rural Austria in the 1960s, and also memories both of her husband, Günther Eich, who died in 1972, and her son, Clemens, who died in 1990.
Die Beatles im herbstlichen Wien.
The Beatles in Autumn, Vienna.
Die Beatles im herbstlichen Wien mit A Hard Day's
The Beatles in autumn, Vienna with A Hard Day's Night.
Sie landeten am Wochenende, wie auf vertrautem Boden, im Gartenbaukino.
We were talking about the space between us all.
Gegen 18 Uhr. Vielleicht um eine Spur geisterhafter, aber nicht weniger überwältigend als damals, vor 30 Jahren. Sie waren in Richard Lesters Regie auf dem Weg zu ihren Auftritten. Ihr Tempo schien mir in diesem Film noch gewachsen. Sie hechteten über die Leinwand, wie ich früher und zuweilen noch heute zu den Biennale und anderen Filmen. Offenbar waren sie auf der Flucht vor einige. Was noch auf sie zukam: Weltruhm, Geld, Adelstitel, vor den harten Tagen und den Nächten danach.
They arrived at the Gartenbau cinema at the weekend around 6 p.m. We were talking about the space between us all. Perhaps a fraction more ghost-like, but no less overwhelming than in those days, 30 years ago. Directed by Richard Lester, they were on their way to their performances, and it seemed to me their tempo had increased in this film. They rushed headlong across the screen, as I used to, and occasionally still do, rush myself to films at the Biennale and elsewhere. They were running away from things which still lay ahead of them. International fame, money, aristocratic titles, from the long, hard days and nights which followed. Looking up, I noticed I was late.
Heute fühlt man sich leicht gejagt und immer zu spät dran.
These days, we always feel slightly harried and always behind the clock.
Es gehört immer mehr zum Umgangston, gejagt zu sein.
And being harried is increasingly part of how we deal with each other.
Wer Zeit hat, will keine haben.
Anyone who has time claims not to.
Wer in den harten und glücklichen Biennale-Tagen der Leinwand mit den Beatles nachjagt, kommt kaum dazu, nachzudenken. Aber die Beatles selbst, um deren Willen Frauen ihre Kinder zu früh bekamen und andere Kinder in Schreikämpfe ausbrachen,
And anyone who rushes headlong with the Beatles from screen to screen during those happy days of the Biennale, and difficult ones, barely had a chance to think. But what of the Beatles themselves, for whose sake girls were hysterical and pregnant women had their babies weeks prematurely?
Bestimmten die Hechtsprünge von Liverpool weg nach Hamburg, Paris und quer über den Atlantik schon vor allen diesen Zielen ihre Tage?
Did their headlong dives away from Liverpool to Hamburg, Paris, and across the Atlantic rule their days even before they ever reached those destinations?
3 von ihnen leben noch. Man könnte sie fragen.
3 of them are still alive. We could ask them.
Yellow Submarine. Der Atlantik war, als die Beatles gerade aufwuchsen, das Ziel. Die erste Reise nach dem Krieg. England, 1948. Noch ohne einen einzigen Beatle kam London in Sicht. Ich wohnte bei meiner Schwester in einem Wohnblock über den Bahngleisen von Paddington Station. Meine Mutter bei ihrer Schwester in einem Boardinghaus nahe Finchley Road, die schon einige damals Finchley-Straße nannten. So viele Emigranten gab es dort schon, keine Reichen.
Yellow Submarine! While the Beatles were growing up, the Atlantic was the destination. The first journey after the war. England in 1948. Yes, before there was even a single Beatle, London came into view. I lived with my sister in an apartment block above the tracks at Paddington Station, My mother lived with her sister in a boarding house near Finchley Road, which some people called Finchley Strasse, even back then, because so many of the emigrants already lived there, although not very rich ones.
Selbst das Geld für die Milch fehlte uns. Alles war damals penniless. Andere Emigranten kümmerten sich um ihre Milchflaschen und das kühle Kaminfeuer.
We didn't even have enough money for the milk. Everyone was penniless in those days. Yet other immigrants occupied themselves with milk bottles and the cold hearth.
Aber auch die Beatles hatten um diese Zeit noch keine Pilzköpfe, keinen Adelsrang und kein Geld. Alles war offen.
But at this time, the Beatles did not yet have mop tops, aristocratic titles, or money either. Everything was open.
Canetti lebte in einer kleinen Wohnung nahe der Finchley Road und Sigmund Freud hatte schon das großbürgerliche Grab in Golders Green bezogen.
Canetti was living in a small apartment on the Finchley Road, whilst Sigmund Freud had already gone to his old bourgeois grave in Golders Green.
Für einige a hard day, für uns aber auch schon die dazugehörige glückliche Nacht. Alles erschien als neues Glück. Weihnachten rückte näher, ohne dass ein einziger Penny in Sicht kam.
Some had a hard day, but we'd already had the happy night which goes with it too. Everything looked like a new piece of luck. Christmas was approaching, with not even a single penny in sight.
Die kleine Tochter meiner Schwester, geboren 1942, dem Jahr, in dem unsere Angehörigen aus Wien deportiert wurden, hatte sich von Father Christmas einen Puppenwagen gewünscht und bekommen.
My sister's little daughter, born in 1942, the year in which our relatives were deported from Vienna, she'd asked Father Christmas for a doll's pram and received it too.
War von Wilkes, aus Blech.
Oh, it was from Woolworths and made out of tin.
Sie gab ihm mir einen Augenblick zu halten, öffnete die Fenster und rief, "Thank you, Father Christmas", über die Gleisstränge.
Yes, she gave it to me to hold for a moment, opened the windows and called out, "Thank you, Father Christmas," over the railway tracks.
Da waren die Beatles schon denkbar.
The Beatles were already imaginable. What do you see when I turn out the light?
Das wollen nur die Kleinen wirklich wissen. Die anderen fürchten solche Fragen.
Only the little ones really want to know that. The older ones are afraid. When I turn out the light.
Soll das nicht heißen, dass einer weggeht?
Doesn't that mean someone is going away?
Unser Sohn fürchtete schon, bald nachdem er die Augen aufgeschlagen hatte, die Abschiede.
Our own little son, before he opened his eyes, was already afraid of saying.
Es half nichts, ihm zu sagen, dass man immer von jedem für immer Abschied nehmen muss.
It was no use telling him that everyone always has to say goodbye to everyone.
Mehr trösteten da die Stimmen der Beatles oder Bob Dylans durch die 60s und durchs Haus in Großgmein. Das Gegenteil von Großbritannien.
But more consolation for him came from the Beatles and from Bob Dylan, pounding through the 60s and through that house in Großgemein, the opposite of Great Britain.
Unter diesen Stimmen versammelten sich die Freunde, die manchmal über Nacht blieben und sich russische Namen zulegen. Sergei, Ivan, Ilya, Nikolai.
He and his friends came together, sometimes staying overnight, and gave themselves Russian names. Sergei, Ivan, Ilya, Nikolai.
Und auch die Seinigen kamen mit diesen Stimmen vorerst wieder. Seine kleine Schwester aus der Schule, sein Vater von langen, seine Mutter von kürzeren Reisen.
And back to him with these voices came his own family, his little sister from school, his father from long journeys, and his mother from shorter ones.
Auf einer Lesereise kam ich einmal nach Liverpool. Den Kindern hatte ich versprochen, etwas Beatle-ähnliches aufzutreiben. Tatsächlich gelang es mir an einem Nachmittag, an dem der Regen zugleich mit dem Ruß auf Liverpool fiel, mit einem Onkel von Ringo Starr in seiner engen Wohnung Tee zu trinken.
Once on a reading tour, I visited Liverpool. I had promised the children to find something Beatle-like. And indeed I managed, one afternoon when the rain was falling on Liverpool, together with the soot, to have afternoon tea with one of Ringo Starr's uncles in his narrow apartment.
War ganz freundlich.
Und interessiert.
Und hatte keine Ahnung, wo Österreich liegt.
He was perfectly friendly and interested and had no idea where Austria is.
I have to admit that I had fun translating this one. I puzzled for quite a long time about how to translate Eichinger's characterisation of the Beatles' hairstyles as Pilzköpfe, which literally means mushroom heads or even fungus heads. Then, from somewhere in my childhood in the 1960s and 70s, I dredged up the expression mop tops, which I think is what Aichinger would call Beatle-ähnlich or Beatle-like. And I was particularly taken by that line about the afternoon when the rain was falling on Liverpool together with the soot. Our final reading is called The Cemetery of the Nameless, and it deals with an unusual film, a documentary about people who commit suicide by throwing themselves in the Danube. And Aichinger saw the film in an unusual place, a temporary cinema at one of Vienna's main railway stations. As you'll hear in this piece, Aichinger has trouble with the two men sitting next to her. Well, as a translator, I had even more trouble with them. It began with what she calls the men, two stritzis, which was a word I hadn't come across before, but which I managed to track down and to translate reasonably accurately as two rough and ready characters. And later, Aichinger quotes what these characters say, but I could only understand about half of that because it's in some variety of Austrian German, which is something I'm not good at, as you'll hear shortly when I read. So at this point, I'd like to thank my Austrian-born colleagues Andrea Bandhauer at the University of Sydney and Leo Kretzenbacher at the University of Melbourne, who filled in the gaps for me when I emailed them my half-baked translations. Though doubtless they both rolled on the floor laughing for a few minutes before they emailed me back. That being said, I should finish by pointing out that in the Cemetery of the Nameless, Aichinger refers to two key sites from her years in Nazi-era Vienna. After all, many of us here this evening are halfway through a conference about place, memory, narrative, and trauma. In mentioning any cemetery, Aichinger invokes the Jewish section of Vienna's Central Cemetery, which she also mentions in the first piece you heard this evening. The Jewish section was a place of refuge for Aichinger and her mother between 1938 and 1945 because her maternal grandfather was buried there, and it was one of the few places where they were unlikely to be disturbed or molested. And in the Cemetery of the Nameless, Aichinger also refers to Vienna's Sweden Bridge, as she does over and over again in her writings and interviews. That was the last place she saw her relatives when they were deported to the extermination camps in May 1942. Der Friedhof der Namenlosen.
The cemetery of the nameless. Every night, as I gazed up at the window, I said softly to myself the word paralysis. James Joyce, Dubliners.
Dieser Einsicht kann man nichts hinzufügen, außer vielleicht den Eindruck von Nikolaus Geierhalters Dokumentarfilm Angeschwemmt. Vorgestern bei sonst extrem dürftigen Kinoprogramm im Westbahnhof in einem provisorischen, bald wieder verschwindenden Kino.
There's nothing you can add to this insight, except perhaps the impression left by Nikolaus Geierhalter's film Washed Up. The day before yesterday, when all other films on offer were extremely poor, at the Westbahnhof, in a temporary cinema which will soon disappear again.
In der zügigen, offenen Halle sind gerade noch 2 Plätze in der ersten Reihe frei.
In the drafty open concourse, only 2 seats in the front row are left.
Der Platz links von mir bleibt unbesetzt. Rechts unterhalten sich 2 Stritzis. Einer davon spricht durchgehend. Er unterbricht sich kaum, behält aber aggressiv und sprungbereit die Leinwand im Auge.
The seat to my left remains unoccupied, but to my right, 2 rough and ready characters chat away. One of them speaks interminably, practically without interruption, but he keeps an eye on the screen, aggressive, ready to spring into action.
Vorspann gibt es keinen, auch keine Werbung. Nicht einmal, statt des Löwen von Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, die Einschaltung: Sie befinden sich in einem Wiener Kino.
There are no opening credits, nor any advertisements either, nor even in place of the MGM lion, some interpolated frame saying, "You are in one of Vienna's cinemas."
Das wäre hier auch ziemlich daneben. Die Personen dieses Films sind keine Darsteller, auch keine Laiendarsteller. Es sind auch nicht viele. 2 oder 3 Hilfsarbeiter, ein Fischer, ein Leichenbestatter, ein Nationalparkwächter und Vielredner, der den Friedhof der Namenlosen in Alban und die Au niemandem gönnt. Am wenigsten den Wienern, die ihn in Wut bringen.
But that would be rather out of place here. For the people in this film are not actors, nor lay actors, nor are there many of them. 2 or 3 assistants, a fisherman, an undertaker, and a voluble national park keeper who does not want to allow anyone into the cemetery of the nameless in Alban, or into the meadows nearby, least of all the Viennese, who make him furious.
Dieser Wächter weiß, wozu es bei ihnen reicht. Sie kommen von weit her, eben aus Wien, zerstampfen die Wiesen, durchbrechen den Auwald, reißen aus dem Boden, was er hergibt. Zurück bleiben verschreckte Vögel, Butterbrotpapiere und Verwüstung. Die armseligen Blumen sind ausgerissen und verstreut. Alban wird sich nie mehr erholen. Liegt da wie nach einem schlechten Traum.
This keeper knows how much the Viennese are good for they come from a long way off, indeed from Vienna. Trample on the grass, make paths through the woods, and tear whatever they can out of the ground. They leave behind them frightened birds, sandwich wrappings, and a trail of devastation. The poor, miserable flowers are torn out and thrown around. Alban will never recover. It lies there as if after a bad dream.
Aber da hat Unrecht. Alban kann mit Träumen besser umgehen als Grinzing oder kalten Leut geben. Es ist von Träumen erfunden.
But that's where the keeper is wrong. For Alban can deal with dreams better than Grinsink or Kaltenleutgeben, for it's created by dreams.
Der Leichenbestatter, weißhaarig und barhäuptig, im langen Mantel, spricht von den Toten wie von heranwachsenden Kindern, denen man zu einer halbwegs möglichen Zukunft verhelfen sollte.
The undertaker, white-haired and bare-headed in a long coat, speaks of the dead as of growing children whom one should help to achieve a halfway possible future.
Hat sie aus dem Wasser geholt, gewaschen, getrocknet und begraben.
He has pulled them out of the water, washed them, dried them, and buried them.
Die Donau ist großzügig, wie nimmt jeden und gibt ihn wieder her, auch wenn keiner nach ihm verlangt.
The Danube is generous, as he is, takes everyone and gives them back again, even if no one asks for them.
Die Eltern eines 34-jährigen Selbstmörders haben die üblichen Blumen gebracht und sind ratlos, wie sie gekommen sind, wieder gegangen.
The parents of a 34-year-old man who had committed suicide brought the usual flowers and were as much at a loss when they left as when they arrived.
Josef Fuchs, der Leichenbestatter, spricht von einem seiner Schützlinge, der sich, ehe er in die Donau ging, von der Schwedenbrücke stürzte und am Kopf verletzte. Fuchs begräbt genug aus der Landschaft, aber Umwege, hastige Versuche quittiert er mit Kopfschütteln. Sobald er ins Bild kommt, hält sogar der rechts von mir einen Augenblick lang den Mund, ehe er wieder loslegt.
Josef Fuchs, the undertaker, speaks of one of his protégés who, before he went into the Danube, fell from the Schwedenbrücke and injured his head. Fuchs buries enough from the landscape, but he acknowledges detours and hasty attempts by shaking his head. When he appears on the screen, the character to my right even shuts up for a moment before letting loose again.
War mir zu kalt, das Wasser. Und hat Glück, wenn keine Ohr hat, die was warm zurückholt.
Be too cold for me, that water. Can count himself lucky he don't have an old lady to fetch him back.
Ein rumänisches Wohnboot taucht auf. Zullen, sag mal, bemerkt er kritisch.
A Romanian houseboat appears. Oh, they're called barges, he remarks critically.
Es ist ein langes, solides Boot, blank gescheuert wie U-Boote, ehe sie torpediert werden.
It's a long, solid boat, scrubbed clean, like U-boats when they're torpedoed.
Von den beiden an Deck spricht nur die Frau. 4 Kinder in Rumänien, 7 Enkel. Was soll man tun? Der Mann sagt nichts. Er ist der Captain, aber kein Wort von "Oh Captain, mein Captain."
Of the couple on the deck, only the woman speaks. 4 children in Romania, 7 grandchildren. What can you do? The man says nothing. He's the captain, but there's no sign of, "Oh, Captain, my Captain."
Stattdessen, und ohne die Frage abzuwarten, die Frau. Wovon wir leben? Nicht vom Geld. Wir leben von den Hühnern.
Instead, and without waiting for the question, the woman says, "What do we live on? Not money. We live on the chickens."
Die sind auch an Bord. Ratlos wie auf dem Bauernhof. Manchmal gibt's Hühnerschnitzel, sonst nur Eier.
They're on board too, at a loss, just as if on a farm. Sometimes there's chicken schnitzel, otherwise just eggs.
Sie ist zufrieden.
She's satisfied.
So sie Tusse nehmen, der Captain. Der Euler lässt ihm nicht aus, sagt der neben mir gegen Ende des Films.
Should get a girl, the captain. His old lady won't let him go. says the man next to me towards the end of the film.
Die Pulkauer Weinstuben, schräg gegenüber, die jeden begrüßen, der aus Saalfelden oder Paris kommt, wirken trüb, halb verdunkelt. Sie stellen sich tot. Man sollte sie nicht wecken, auch wenn es dem Film gemäß wäre, den man eben für immer verlassen hat. Aber er bleibt im Kopf. Die Donau und ihre Au haben andere Prioritäten geschaffen.
The Pulkau Wine Bar, diagonally opposite, which welcomes everyone from Saarfelden or Paris, seems gloomy, half-darkened. It's playing dead. You shouldn't wake it, even if that might be appropriate to the film which you've just left forever. But the film sticks in the mind. The Danube and its meadows have created different priorities.
Wie die Hühner auf dem Wohnboot. Wie Hühner überhaupt.
Like the chickens on the houseboat. Like chickens. Anyway.